All right, thanks everybody for joining us today, and welcome to what is the fourth in the series of webinars, the goal of which is to support the development of the next stage of Child of the North, which is a joint initiative between the N8 Research Partnership and the Northern Health Science Alliance. My name is Stephen Parkinson, and I'm a Research Partnership Manager for the N8. If you joined us in one of the previous seminars in the series, welcome back. If you're joining us for the first time today, it's good to have you here and welcome. In these webinars, we hope to showcase some of the range of current research activity from the universities in the N8, both working with and in support of children and young people and families within their local areas across the North as a whole and beyond. We hope that by doing this, we will raise awareness of what is going on in this area across all our members, and also may lead to new connections being made. This will also hopefully inform our thinking about future priorities for Child of the North, both as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, and yet we find that further crises, including the cost of living crises, are affecting our young people increasingly. And I'm delighted that today we are joined by a fantastic lineup of speakers from the University of Sheffield to tell us about some of their latest research. We also want you to contribute. There will be an opportunity to ask questions after each of the presentations. And if we have any time at the end, we can also have an open discussion about what we've heard today and how we think that could feed into future priorities for Child of the North. Before we kick off formally, just a little bit of housekeeping. The session is being recorded and will be made available for those who are unable to attend today back on YouTube. And if you want to submit questions, you can either wait until the end of the presentations, but if you want to submit them as the presentations go along, if you do so via the chat function, I will pick them up there and we can pose them then during the Q&A. I will now just pop up the agenda on the screen so everybody knows what we'll be doing. So I will speak briefly about Child of the North and the background, and then we'll go into the presentations from the colleagues from Sheffield, and we have four in total. We have one from Michelle Black, followed by Ryan Bramley, Dawn Watkins, and Lauren Powell. And as I say, if we have some time at the end, we will also have a bit of a discussion. As I say, before we run into the presentations, I just want to say a few words about the Child of the North journey so far. I'll keep this pretty brief so we have as much time as possible for our speakers and questions. I did go into slightly more detail about this in the previous sessions, so if you have not heard that before and want to catch up, you can do so on YouTube, and I will send the links around with the link to the recording of this after this session. So in terms of our Child of the North journey so far, so Child of the North was conceived shortly before the pandemic, towards the back end of 2019. As a means of combining and elevating the enormous amount of excellent and impactful research that takes place across the North in relation to children and young people and their experience of growing up in the North. The pandemic, as it hit in 2020, inevitably had an impact on our thinking about what Child of the North should be and what it should hope to achieve. And this led us to define a vision, as you can see on screen there, about creating a platform for collaboration, high quality research and policy engagement to improve the lives of children living in the North in hopefully a post-pandemic age. And just to say that Child of the North is a collaboration, as I said at the top, between the N8 and the Northern Health Science Alliance, which between our organisations we share as members the 8 most research-intensive universities in the North. Our two organisations also share common goals in terms of advocating on behalf of our members and the North's research and innovation strengths, and also connecting industry and academic expertise across the North. Child of the North unites the N8 and the NHSA also in our interest in helping tackle health inequalities, but we also want to go much wider than that in terms of thinking about the influences on children's lives and those things that support their happiness and well-being. So going back to sort of quick overview of our journey. So as I say, Child of the North was selected by the N8's governance in late 2019 as a potential new priority area in recognition of the potential critical mass of expertise across our universities and the potential for genuine impact on a regional scale. As mentioned, as the pandemic progressed, we sought to recalibrate our vision. We now decided to focus on what we could do as a collective of universities to help improve children's lives in the post-pandemic age. At the same time, we nominated a set of institutional champions, 1 to 2 per N8 university, who provide a key point of contact at each institution. However, as the pandemic progressed, we recognized that the scale and urgency of the impact of COVID on children's lives meant that we decided to pivot away from our original plan of focusing on developing a large programmatic activity to see how we could respond rapidly to what was happening and what was unfolded. And this led to the idea for our first output, which was the Child of the North report. So hopefully many of you have seen this. This was, as I say, the first output from Child of the North and was published at the end of 2021. The purpose of us coming together to produce the report was to capture the impact of the pandemic on children growing up in the North and their experiences of doing it. In doing so, it also unavoidably looks back at the impact of a decade of austerity on the lives of children in the North, the inequalities this has highlighted, and how the pandemic was further exacerbating these inequalities. And the report represents the work of more than 40 authors from across the N8 universities, but also the Northern Arcs, NHS trusts across the North, the Bradford Institute of Health Research, and several other universities. And through the report, we wanted to emphasise how vital it is to keep the voices of children and young people themselves at the heart of COVID-19 pandemic recovery and the levelling up agenda. And through this, we included a number of case studies amplifying children's voices. The report includes a total of 18 policy recommendations, which we consciously designed to be broad and deep enough that, if enacted in a timely fashion and at scale, could profoundly improve the health, well-being and life chances of children in the North and elsewhere. So looking beyond what the Child in the North report, we had a parliamentary launch for the report in March 2022, which was hosted by Liz Twist, who's the MP for Blaydon. We had a number of other senior MPs in attendance there, including Bridget Phillipson, who's the Shadow Secretary of State for Education, Emma Lawbuck, Kim Ledbetter and others. And one of the real direct results of that parliamentary launch was the proposal to set up a Child of the North all-party parliamentary group, with the idea that the APPG would hold inquiries looking in more detail at some of the issues raised in the Child of the North report, and starting with the cost of living crisis. I'll say more about this in a second. At the same time, we're now looking to develop a set of future priorities and to scope out hopefully a large collaborative bid or bids that will help to develop the network further across our members and our partners more broadly, and to provide a focal point and launch pad for future activities. So I mentioned the APPG, which launched in October, and at that first meeting, Emma Lawbuck and Mary Robinson were elected as the co-chairs. Since then, the APPG has held 2 evidence sessions in its first inquiry, as I say, on child poverty and the cost of living crisis. And the report from this inquiry is due to be published next week, so keep your eye out for that. And then finally, as I say, just back to sort of future priority setting. Thinking if we want to develop a strategy for future collective action, we first need to have a greater understanding of what we're currently doing across the N8 and potential points of connection and what our collective strengths are. So the idea, again, behind these webinars is to help build up this picture, which in turn will inform development of our future priorities and as I say, collaborative bids. We're also holding a workshop in a few weeks' time to focus on both of these issues. So again, there'll be a further update following that. And the key questions we sort of want to address are what is it that we can do collectively that we can't do alone, e.g. either on a regional basis and or by sharing experience and good practice. And just to re-emphasize, we're not talking about research alone, but also about policy engagement and impact. And one of our key goals is to identify where we need to build and sustain capacity across the N8 to realise the potential benefits of working collectively. And by seeking significant external funding through bidding, we hope to be able to do this. So at this point, I will stop and I will hand over to the first of our presenters, who is Michelle Black. Michelle, over to you.
Hello, hi, sorry, Stephen, hi, yeah, thank you. Right, can you see my screen okay? Yeah, lovely. Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Michelle and I'm just finishing an NIHR doctoral fellowship at SHAR at the University of Sheffield. And I'm going to talk about inequalities in mid-childhood development and how that impacts on adolescent health. So in this country, if you're born into disadvantage, the premise is that you've got to try and escape. So the circumstances of your family life are hugely important from birth. And one of the main routes out of disadvantage and route to a better life is through education, as we all know. This is a scene from Derry Girls, and in it, they're waiting for their GCSE results. And one of them says, "We're girls, we're poor, we're Irish, and we're Catholic. If we don't get our GCSE results, we're stuffed." And I really like that scene because it resonates in terms of our characteristics determine our life chances, but education is very much seen across society as the route out. So how is all that relevant to this research then? Okay, so we all develop from birth, and our development precedes formal education. And we measure in public health kind of your level of development when you start school. That's termed school readiness, and it's a composite measure of a number of aspects of development: physical, language and communication, cognitive, and social and emotional. I did a systematic review on how those aspects of development are related to adolescent health, and social and emotional well-being and cognitive development were strongly associated with adolescent health. Now, we know that optimal development of cognition and social and emotional well-being are important for health in adulthood. So in relation to cognition, it helps in terms of your the job that you're going to get, social status, and your health behaviors. And social and emotional well-being is important in childhood for mental health in adulthood. But we know a lot less about the kind of interrelations between those aspects of development and what impact that might have on adolescent health. And you might say, well, why does that matter in terms of adolescent health? If we know those things are beneficial for adult health, why do we need to know what they do in adolescence? Well, it's important for a number of reasons. In terms of life course development, adolescent health is a very important period in terms of, it's another relatively critical period of development. And it's also a point where good health enables you to select into education. So in terms of health selection. So optimizing health in adolescence is really important. And especially now when there's quite a crisis in adolescent health, particularly in terms of mental health and overweight. So there's an evidence gap there, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, there's quite a policy gap. So we do a lot around best start in life, and rightly so. It's a critical period of development, lots of neurodevelopment going on. And it's also, there's lots of health economics evidence in the field for why it's important to invest early in terms of later gains in terms of human capital. So most countries have a very strong policy emphasis on the early years, which is really important. But what about development in mid-childhood? So that's where my kind of interest is. What happens then when children start school? We know there's gaps in terms of their levels of development. What's going to go on to happen? What will that mean for their health in adolescence? So my research, the question was basically about identifying and describing inequalities in children's social and emotional and cognitive development. So that I looked at those separately, but also together. So multi-trajectory development by longitudinal trajectories in mid-childhood, age 3 to 14, and then quantify associations between those trajectories of development and adolescent health outcomes. So the measures are there on the screen. The measures were from the Millennium Cohort study, which is obviously a large UK representative cohort. I looked at measures of social and emotional behaviour at age 3, 5, 7, 11, 14 using the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire. And then in terms of cognitive ability, I looked at the test scores from the British Ability Scales at ages 3 to 11. Age 14 was a slightly different test, but still testing verbal ability. And then the outcomes at age 14 and 17 were overweight or obese and mental ill health. So this is, I think, the first study to analyse those aspects of development concurrently in mid-childhood. The general hypothesis is that there's an interplay between cognitive ability and socio-emotional behaviour, and the socio-emotional behaviour conducive to optimizing it, and that can interact over time to influence adolescent health. Similarly to how those two things interact to influence academic outcomes. Yeah, so your social and emotional well-being is conducive to your ability to learn. We know that's good for academic outcomes. Is there something also happening there, and is that shaping health? Okay, so that's the rationale for studying those things together. The method that I used for the trajectories was called group-based multi-trajectory modelling. I won't go into that in detail unless anyone's particularly interested. And I did that on, as I said, the Millennium Cohort study. So I'll head straight to the findings. So first question, so are there groups following similar trajectories of social, emotional, and cognitive well-being at population level from age 3 to 14? Yes, there were 4 groups identified. So this is what the model produced. I'll just spend a small bit of time on this so people understand it. So you can see there's four groups of 2 charts there, if you like. The left-hand side is the group, the blue one is the group of children who are assigned a probability of no problems throughout childhood in either of those domains of development. And the bulk of the children were in that group. The next group, the orange one, are children who develop problems in social and emotional behavior in late childhood, kind of from age 7 onwards, but they don't have any concurrent problems in their cognitive ability. Okay. The next group, the kind of mustardy one, they're children who have early problems in both aspects of development, but they're on a resolving trajectory. So that's really good. So they've started school with early problems in terms of their cognitive ability and their social and emotional behavior, but those problems are reducing. They're not totally gone, but they're reducing. So that's good. It shows that something good is happening for a cohort of children when they start school. They're a little bit behind, something's going on, and they're heading in the right way. That's very positive. And then the third group is the children who start school with problems in both aspects of development, and they persist pretty much throughout the school years. Okay, so 4 groups at population level. So what does that mean then? So it means in the UK, a typical class of children in primary school would have 30 children in it. So in a typical class, bearing in mind what is typical, I gave this talk to a group of practitioners a few weeks ago, and we had a very long conversation about what is typical because it very much depends on where you live. But let's say a typical class, of 30 children, you'd have about 7 in an adverse development group. So that's one of those 3 groups other than the blue one. So about 7 children. Of those 7, 3 will develop social and emotional behavioral problems in late childhood from about age 7 onwards. 2 to 3 will start school with problems in both of those aspects of development, but they'll be on a resolving trajectory and doing better, which is good. And then you'll have 1 to 2 children with persistent problems in both aspects of development throughout childhood. Okay, obviously those numbers will be much greater in areas of disadvantage, which I'll come to in a minute. So my next question then was, what do those groups look like? So to do that, I did multinomial regression. So the comparative group was the no problem group. So compared to the no problem group, what's the risk of, what are the risk factors of being on the adverse trajectory groups, okay? So a common risk factor for being in any of those problem groups, if you like, compared to the no problem group, is being a boy, having a familial disadvantage in terms of a mother with lower educational qualifications, and poorer maternal mental health. That's how I measured disadvantage in the Millennium Cohort study. I also looked at neighbourhood disadvantage in terms of quintile of deprivation. And again, a common risk factor was children in the most deprived quintiles were more likely to be in an adverse development group. And then I also looked at some school factors. So children who classed themselves as being bullied all the time were more likely to be in one of the adverse groups. And also a school factor in terms of how much parents were involved with the school was also a factor. Poor involvement or lack of involvement was increased the risk of being in any of the adverse trajectory groups. And there were some differences between them. I'll come on to that in a second. So the first interpretation is that there are inequalities in children's development in mid-childhood, okay? Disadvantage matters. The closer it is to the child matters in terms of the trajectory of development. So by that, I mean family disadvantage in terms of the way it was measured in terms of mother's mental health or mother's education. So it's closer to the child, it's in the home. That's a stronger risk factor than neighborhood deprivation for children who had late onset or persistent problems. For children who had the early problems, neighborhood deprivation was just a stronger risk factor. So I think the implication of that is that it supports targeting early years services by neighborhood disadvantage, but that seems less important for children with late and persistent problems because the family disadvantage is much more pervasive and continues to be pervasive as children age. Another interpretation was around minority ethnicity. This was very strongly associated with the early problems group, but not with the late and the persistent problems. So the implication of this finding is that it supports targeting children from minority ethnicity for early support on starting school. That's good. Another implication, I think, is that the resolving problems trajectory suggests that schools are getting early support right for some children. I did this presentation to some teachers and some people at Public Health Council in Sheffield, and they said they were really pleased to see that it was a good message for schools to hear at a time when everything's so bad. The fact that schools are doing things right for a lot of children who start school and who are behind. So I think that's a good message. Then the third question was, is the trajectory of development associated with being overweight or having mental ill health problems as a teenager at age 14 and 17? So back to your same, these are the same groups here. So compared to the no problems group, yes, so the late socio-emotional problems, that 10% of children, they're more likely to be overweight or have mental ill health problems at age 14 and 17. The early problems group, no. So again, this is a very good story. The children who start school but who are behind, but who catch up, they're not associated with having adverse health in adolescence. I think that's really important. Persistent problem groups, yes. So the 5% of children there, yes, they're more likely to have adverse health at age 14 and 17. The key point here is that if you look at the graphs, it's the social and emotional development that is driving the relationship with health rather than cognitive development. That's not to say cognitive development isn't important. It's just saying when they're studied together, the social and emotional development is driving the relationship. As you can see from the second graph, the orange graph, where you have social and emotional problems, but you don't have the concurrent cognitive problems, there's still that association with later adverse health. That was supported as well when I analysed the trajectories, the aspects of development separately. The odds of overweight or mental health were stronger for social and emotional development. So to look at the associations between the trajectories of development and the health outcomes, I did that using logistic regression. In the model, I also controlled for socioeconomic confounders, and the relationship still exists. Okay. So the odds are there if you're interested. So for the children in the late and persistent problems group, they had odds of 1.5. They had 1.5 times the odds of being overweight or obese at age 14 compared to the no problems group. That went up a little bit at age 17. Mental ill health, the odds were 2.5 to 3 times greater. And the early problems group, as I said, not associated with later adverse health. Okay, so inequalities in mid-childhood development, that's going to be a problem for later health, but the relationship exists even after you control for confounders. So something can still be done beyond the early years. Yeah. So interpretation there. So again, back to your typical class of 30 children, you'd expect about 4 to 5 to be in an adverse development group, and that will have an adverse effect on their health in adolescence. And you'll expect about 2 to 3 children with early problems to be on a resolving trajectory, and that's not associated with the later poor health. So overall interpretation is that mid-childhood development is socially patterned, and that has implications for our later health. The relationship exists even after accounting for disadvantage, so that means we can do stuff in terms of mitigation. That's not to make this an individual problem or an individual responsibility, but it's to acknowledge, I suppose, agency and different things that schools can do, as well as the wider prevention work that we all advocate for. Other important points, social and emotional development is driving the relationship with health. The timing of the resolution or emergence of problems matters. Early problems which resolves, it's good. Supporting children who are not school ready and providing enhanced support makes a lot of sense. We need to think about how we observe for late onset of problems, because that's going to be a problem in terms of later health. Policy implications. So we need to build on best start in life policies. If we're to do that, if health is the focus, we need to have a central focus on social and emotional well-being. That may have implications for school and education policy, regulators, all sorts of things. We need to think about the fact that different factors drive early, late, and persistent problems, and therefore our interventions and our targeting need to speak to that. For example, minority ethnicity and neighbourhood deprivation is really important for early years, familial disadvantage important throughout. I think we need policy on both prevention and mitigation, and need to think an awful lot about what schools as institutions can do. Big question on how we fund education, what we expect education to be, and that's probably time for another talk. But anyway, so yeah, they're the related publications so far. Initial systematic review, which decided on the focus of those 2 aspects of development, and just an early conference proceeding paper, which was just on cognitive development. The rest of this, the whole study has been submitted for publication and just under peer review. Thank you ever so much for listening. Happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rochelle. That was great. And a huge apologies. I forgot to give you a proper introduction, so I will now do it after the fact. And Michelle is a research fellow and public health registrar, and as she's just presented, she's in the final stages of her NIHR doctoral research fellowship. She is a pharmacist by background and has many years experience in the NHS. And thank you again, Michelle. Anybody have any questions for Michelle based on that? Selena, I saw you made one comment in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to follow up on that.
Yeah, I may have missed it, Michelle. But did you control for SEN summer-born type needs in terms of the adverse trajectories, or consider that within the models? Yeah. And related to that, to a certain extent, I wonder, the children that aren't ready for school, that could be related to SEN that hasn't been maybe diagnosed yet. Also, the late onset could be. But also, if you looked at familial factors, so is it to do with things like ACEs, domestic violence, or is it, parent education, would you say?
Yeah, great question, Selena. Thank you. In terms of the SEN, obviously that could be a factor for children with persistent problems or late problems or early problems. I decided not to exclude any special educational needs at the outset, and just to include everyone and see what trajectories the model pulls out. Obviously, further studies would clearly want to do more analysis and look at SEN and what that means and how that impacts. But I didn't want to exclude anyone, if you like, at this initial stage. That's just a test, sorry. Typical, sorry about that. Yeah, so that's SEN, and it's a very good point, and it's also a point that practitioners bring up and teachers when I do this talk to them. Summer-born, yeah, in terms of the cognitive ability, the T-scores are standardized to take account for when the children are born and all of that. The other, the social and emotional behavior scores aren't. So more could be done, I imagine, around age, yes. And then what was your third point? You made another point about disadvantage.
I was just thinking about that sort of factor around school readiness being, important, and whether, does that tend to be related to sort of what's going on in the home, I guess, rather than what's within the child. So, are you looking at things like ACEs, domestic violence?
Yeah, it's very much related to what's gone on in the home. But I didn't look at any of that. I wanted to specifically look at like when children are kind of moving on, if you like, in terms of starting formal education. Yeah. Yes, we know everything that's gone on before is damaging. But they start education at this point in time. We know gaps in readiness are linked to disadvantage, and that's going to be a problem. But what happens then? Because there's a massive opportunity in terms of schools and education policy for what can be done at a much broader level at that point. It's not to say that everything that's gone before doesn't matter and will continue to matter, but I didn't drill down to that in detail. But it's a very good point. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
Great. Thanks both. Any more questions for Michelle before we move on? Okay, in which case, thank you very much, Michelle. Really appreciate your contribution. Moving on now to Dr. Ryan Bramley. Ryan is a lecturer in education in the School of Education at Sheffield. In addition to a PhD in education, he holds master's degrees in English literature and social research. Ryan is also a filmmaker and arts-based researcher. His research routinely explores ways in which artistic practice, especially filmmaking, can broaden our understanding of the social world. And Ryan is going to talk to us today about his Evaluating Trespass Prevention project, which seeks to form a better understanding of how young people engage with public safety campaigns, and which was co-produced with young people. Over to you, Ryan.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much as well, Michelle. It's a tough act to follow for sure, and a very different project, I think, in many respects, although I did spot a couple of potential connections there as well, for sure. Thank you for the lovely introduction as well, Stephen. I always love being introduced by other people. I hate introducing myself because I do a terrible job, but yeah, that's great. Can everyone hear me okay, by the way? Is that kind of awkward wait
Yes.
Oh, brilliant. I can't see, I've only got one screen. I can't see faces.
Can hear you, can see you, and see your screen.
Oh, wonderful. That's great. All three. That's brilliant. The Holy Trinity. Thank you ever so much. So yes, so as Stephen said, I'm going to talk a little bit today about a project that ran during the summer of 2020. Ooh, what was it now? 2020. That's so long ago, isn't it? Called Evaluating Trespass Prevention. I'm going to talk particularly about one aspect of that project where we look to co-design new approaches with young people to evaluating the effectiveness of public safety campaigns. And yeah, just a very brief introduction to me, although it's already been done brilliantly by Stephen. I'm a lecturer in education here at the University of Sheffield, and this project actually fit rather nicely in the gap for me between finishing my own PhD and actually getting the job that I've got now. So yeah, it was very nice in many respects in terms of the timing, for sure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Evaluating Trespass Prevention project was all about and why we did it, and particularly about the partnerships involved with that as well. And we're going to discuss what we learned from working with young people to co-design this toolkit. I use the term toolkit a lot in this. What I'm effectively talking about here is a series of questionnaires that could be used, and I believe are now being used by Network Rail to assess the effectiveness of the anti-trespass campaign material that they put out to try and discourage people from committing the act of railway trespass, and also some of the early recommendations that have emerged from the project. I need to correct myself as well. It was 2021. Isn't it weird how COVID just kind of messed up timelines and everything? It was 2021 when this was done. There you go. It would be remiss of me to start talking about this without first giving a big shout out to our project partners who made this project possible. We've got Barnsley College. I'll talk a little bit more about them later on, but I want to particularly give thanks to Alex Dixon, who was at the time the placements coordinator, or one of the placements coordinators at Barnsley College, who helped basically give us access to, well, not just the college itself, but also to work with some of their brilliant students there. Network Rail as well. This is a big partnership with Network Rail. They really wanted to kind of explore this, and as I say, you know, really like the idea of having a new toolkit that could see how effective the material that they're already putting out is. And we also had a link up with the National Railway Museum as well, including a lovely trip up there. Me and my colleague, Dr. Anish Barai, had a wonderful kind of forage through some of their archive material, which was great. And we also did a celebration event for the young people that we work with there as well. Big thanks to Anish, as well as Dr. Becky Parry, who was kind of crucial really in getting this funding in the first place to do this project, and also my colleague Marion Iverson, who is a research associate on this project as well. So what was the Evaluating Trespass Prevention project all about? Well, just to start off with, again, I don't know if people come into this with a kind of idea of how big trespass is as an issue at the moment in the UK. It is actually something that kind of comparatively compared to other nations in the EU, we don't do particularly well on, even though we have often been regarded as having the safest railway in Europe. In fact, recent analysis by the Office for Rail and Road found that we rank 8th in Europe for general passenger safety risk. And we do slightly better on trespasser safety risk, but we still rank 4th on that as well. So there's definitely room for improvement there. And in particular, what we were really interested in was trespass amongst young people. So LNER produced a piece of research in 2021, which found that 1 in 4 young people aged between 12 and 17 knew someone who had committed the act, or the crime rather, of railway trespass. So even though trespass, and what I mean, by the way, just for clarification, of railway trespass isn't just the kind of conventional, if you like, way of, you know, kind of cutting across a railway line. It does also include any trespass on prohibited railway property. So that could be lines of track at railway stations as well. So 1 in 4 people knew somebody who'd committed that crime. We also saw quite a large increase in trespass events from July to December 2021, so around the time that we were doing this project. And the largest increase of those increases, if you like, was in the under 18s age category. There was no fewer than 2,087 child trespass incidents recorded in just 6 months, and that was a 40% increase on the same period in 2019. And it goes without saying, although not every single one of these incidents results in a death, it can be a deadly act, and people do die every year by committing this act of trespass. Considerable efforts have been made by Network Rail, amongst other stakeholders, to try and discourage people, I mean, in particular young people who are a particular demographic of concern, to discourage them from committing the act of trespass. Some of you may have already seen the You versus Train video series that started in 2018, a series of 4 or 5 short films that particularly target young people and try to discourage them from committing this crime by effectively showing them what can happen. I'll talk a little bit more about the nature of some of that content later, because that's something we spoke about to the young people quite a lot as well. In addition to that, particularly given that we're giving this webinar today as part of Child of the North, there's also Switched On, which was a free educational programme that was recently released by Network Rail, promoting rail safety amongst 3 to 16-year-olds. But railway trespass is unfortunately still a growing phenomenon in the UK rather than a trend in decline. We developed this project, which received UKRI National Productivity Investment Fund support, to generate a robust evaluative framework to assess the impact of Network Rail's anti-trespass campaign work. We know from things like, when these videos are shared on things like social media, like Facebook, YouTube, etc., we can see how many views they get, who sees them. To some extent, you can even see who is seeing them with certain analytical tools. But what are people actually doing when they watch them? That's the kind of gap that was identified here by Network Rail. They don't fully understand what people do when they watch this. Is this actively discouraging people from committing or potentially committing the act of railway trespass? We did quite a lot within a relatively short period of time. Given that this was done, the main kind of participatory element of this project was done between May and July 2021. We were actually able to go into a college, and we were very grateful to be hosted by Barnsley College for those 3 months to do a series of, I believe it was 8 workshops. As you can see from the photo over here with me with some kind of teddy bear face mask on, which I wore quite a lot at the time. We were able to do kind of in-person stuff, but at a distance as well, which, given that we were doing a lot of stuff with cameras as part of this project, was particularly difficult. I'll come on to that in a moment, but first to say that we worked with 4 young people aged between 16 and 19 from Barnsley College. And what we did in the earlier sessions as part of this workshop series was we asked them to watch a series of railway trespass prevention films that were directed towards young people. Some people may have even seen the film Robbie. There were various iterations of this film throughout, I think it was the 70s and 80s, with different presenters and all sorts of stuff, kind of reconstructing what could happen if you trespass on the railway. And as you can probably imagine, it didn't usually end well for poor Robbie here. So we kind of asked them to watch those, and we trialled out, me and Marion, a trespass campaign questionnaire that we'd initially devised. But we actually asked the young people who had lots of opinions on these questions, what do you think? What should we ask other young people about? And they played a massive instrumental part in the questionnaire that we actually handed over to Network Rail. A lot of questions that we changed, particularly when we're talking about kind of feelings and emotions and stuff like that. The language that me and Marion were using wasn't really cutting through. So the young people kind of provided suggestions on how we could tweak those. And finally, we actually asked the students to carry out their own research towards the end as well. I won't talk quite as much about this in this talk, there just simply isn't time for it. But what we asked the young people to then do was to conduct their own interviews. They interviewed railway workers, academics, they even spoke to their own teachers about railway trespass and got some really interesting personal narratives, not necessarily from people who have committed the act themselves, but from certainly from the railway workers' point of view, the effect it has not just on the individual involved, but on other individuals as well. So we're going to talk a little bit now about what we learned. Now, we asked the young people to watch the You versus Train films, and there was I think it was 4 or 5 films as part of this series, and each one took a slightly different angle, focusing on a slightly different narrative. The one that the young people spoke about in particular, and just to say, Henry is, as all the names I'll mention here, a pseudonym. We asked them to watch Tegan's story, which really resonated with them. Henry said that Tegan's story was more like a tragedy, a survivor's story, and that sympathies, the ability to sympathise with this person who had actually committed the act of railway trespass in the past was really informative. As you'll see from this slide here, this is Tegan on the left here. She really did commit the act of railway trespass. This was the only film of the series that showed real life footage of trespass happening. The others were more reconstructions, like this one at the top here. Dramatizations of sometimes real life events, but this actually showed real life footage. And what happened to poor Tegan was she crossed over the railway line at a train station. I think it might have been Brighton off the top of my head, Brighton train station, to get to her friend. It was just quicker for her to cross over the railway track than it was to go over the bridge and over the top. What Tegan didn't realise is that there's an electrified third rail there, and as she walked over, she was electrocuted, almost died. She did survive, but she actually shows in the video the third-degree burns that she has and how much of her body, she talks about how much of her body was covered in them. She gets quite tearful, as you can see from the screenshot here, as she's talking about her lack of confidence and self-esteem because the way of, that this incident impacted her physically as well as mentally and emotionally. This, as I said earlier on, really resonated with the young people, and they told us that it was important for them to see what really happens with a Railway Trespass Act. The reconstructions were, shocking, to excuse the pun, but this really did cut through because this person really did it, and she was remorseful. She is using this film as a platform to encourage, or rather discourage, people from doing this. We also spoke a little bit about the films in general, and yeah, as I said, Henry again here talking about how the other films, it was the individual's ignorance that was on their undoing. In Tegan's case, for example, she didn't know about the electrified third rail, so there's an educational element to these films. But there's also other cases, other films in this series where they did know that it was dangerous to do it, and they did it anyway, and it still resulted in life-threatening injuries. One of the other participants, Tim, discussed this with us, said that films that put you off from trespassing, they do it because you're seeing somebody else going through it, and that can help, which revealed to us that young people aren't always conscious of the danger of crossing on railways. Also talking about the impact it has on railway staff. So another film in the series called Parallel Lines is another dramatic reconstruction. This time not actually kind of closely based on a real life story, but showing a trespass incident that doesn't actually result in an injury to the trespasser, but does actually have a really significant impact on the train driver who had the near miss. So really educated young people that, committing trespass, yes, you might survive it, but what impact does it have on the other people involved? As I say, this was done in 2021. Various things happened around that time. I finished my PhD. I got the lectureship I've got now. It has taken me, I would admit, quite a while to come down to actually writing up formally the publication around this, but I am in the process of doing that now with my colleagues. But yeah, some of the things that came out from this, we took a kind of exploratory participatory approach with the young people. We really wanted this process to be informed by them as much as possible, which was very difficult, obviously, during COVID. We actually did have to pause the workshops at one point because one of the staff members who was supervising these sessions ended up getting COVID herself. So there's all sorts of kind of risks associated with that as well. And obviously we locked that down as soon as we could. So just really did kind of demonstrate the difficulties of doing something, doing a project like this. However, we did believe that we were still, even despite the social distancing, able to break down the barriers between the academics and the students. We were able to build a rapport and generate a kind of openness where the young people, especially towards the end of the workshop series, really felt able to kind of talk to us in an open and frank way. One of the other things I've really been thinking about recently, and I actually did put a bid in for this last year, unfortunately didn't get it, was told it was a fundable bid, but it was just the case that, and it was an internal bid that I put in, and our department had already been so successful in getting a lot of funding from this particular initiative that yeah, it was just one of those cases. But I'm still kind of keeping this idea on the back burner. What if young people themselves are actually empowered to create a public information film of their own? So instead of just asking young people after the film has been made, oh, how did that affect you? What about actually putting the camera in their hands and saying, right, you know, let's give you the skills, let's give you the know-how to make your own film, and see whether that would be more impactful for other young people as well. Yeah, watch this space. Hopefully something will come about for that. And we have, even though publications not come out from this yet, been sharing our experiences with the broader academic community. There's a website that I'd be happy to share the link to called Connect and Reflect. In fact, one of my colleagues who is here today, Dr. Hannah Fairbrother, led that project alongside Katie Ellis. And Hannah Rain, the research assistant on that project, interviewed myself and also the placements coordinator from Barnsley College that I mentioned earlier on, Alex Dixon. And Alex was quoted as saying in that interview, not only does this project help young people with further thinking and their development of their particular skill set, it also helps them with their education as well. I should add that the students we work with are in the digital department of Barnsley College, so they already had an interest and some experience of filmmaking, media making, that sort of thing. I also really like this quote as well. I mean, a lot of what I've talked about today is very serious, but it was great to actually hear that the young people had fun actually engaging with this project as well. Alex said, I feel like a lot of places do think that students are given all the opportunities in the world, and that isn't the case, unfortunately. We enjoyed being a part of it. I had a good time. That's the main thing, isn't it? We want to do fun projects. So it was great to play a small role in actually providing work placement opportunities to these 4 students at Barnsley College. And again, we're absolutely open to looking at that kind of partnership again in the future. I will stop there. Apologies if I've gone slightly over time. I can natter a little bit, as you can probably guess from this, but if anyone does have any questions now, feel free to ask away. If there is time, failing that, do feel free to get in touch with me either via email or via Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ryan. That's a really, really fascinating presentation. I'm sure I'm not the only one who it brought back some slightly harrowing memories of public information films at school when they were younger. Any questions for Ryan? I saw Lauren, you put some really interesting comments in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to follow up on any of those.
I was just kind of thinking out loud, which, as Ryan knows, is pretty dangerous. I was spell checking it and pressed enter by accident, so sorry about that, and my spacebar keeps sticking, so 5 words become 1. But other than that, I was just thinking about how brain development is kind of back to front in humans, and therefore in teenagers it's not quite done yet, so we're not quite finishing the front bit. And if that's not fully developed, which is not in teenagers, they're more likely to make really rubbish decisions, like maybe trespassing on a railway line. So I think it must be so impactful for them to hear from that girl in Brighton, I think you said, who actually experienced what she did. But if they're not making the best decisions, there might be a small portion, and again, you can't please everyone, that are like, so that'll never happen to me, or whatever, I'm really hard and, you know, I'm bulletproof. If there's any other angles that you've explored or that have come up and you've gone, nah, or I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it was a shame we had, you know, like I say, a really short time to kind of work on this project. It all kind of had to be done and dusted by July, and COVID had an impact on it as well. I think it's really interesting what you say about the kind of brain cognitive development side of things. That is absolutely not my area at all, but it's really interesting to hear about that. And maybe that is why this is something that can, you know, often appeal to young people. The whole things around peer pressure and social engagement. There is, you know, and it was really I mean, it was kind of fortuitous for us because we were doing the project at the time, but it was actually really shocking to see TikToks at the time that the young people actually told us about, of people doing kind of railway trespassing challenge kind of things where they, they step onto it or they drop the phone on purpose on it and then they pick it, go on to pick it up again and stuff like that. And it was really shocking. So yeah, it's, I mean, in terms of the grand scheme of things, if you're looking at it demographically in terms of how many people do it from each age group, I can't say an exact figure. I'm sure Network Rail told us it was something like 75% of people, I know actually young people are doing it, so adults who do it. And there's a really fine balance as well to strike here between the educational aspect, so informing people of the dangers of trespass, but that can then actually lead to more trespass because some people do it to intentionally take their own life. So Network Rail have a really difficult and unenviable job of trying to get that balance between education, but also prevention at the same time as well. So yeah, it's fascinating. Like I say, it's a shame we had a relatively short time to spend on this, but I'm sure something else will end up coming from it as well.
Yeah, the other thing I was going to say as well with the whole brain stuff, I know it's not sort of the focus of it, but just because you said it was interesting, the links between, so the prefrontal cortex is like your, in its simplest form, your personality and your decision making. And if that's not fully developed, neither are the connections with the rest of the brain. So you might think of like the amygdala, which is emotional. So if you, I don't know, if you walk down the street and you hear a loud bang, someone with PTSD who's come from war might think, gun, because that connection's not quite what it would ideally be. Whereas you and I might walk down the street and think, jump and go, oh, look, a car engine backfired, okay, and not think much of it. Whereas in a teenager in that situation, they might not have that link to their amygdala that says, oh, wait, if I do that, not only is it a bad idea, it could have this impact in the future. It's going to make me feel like this. And in fact, the thought of that makes me feel a bit scared, so I'm not going to do it. That might not happen in the same way it might a fully developed brain. But
so in that, I wonder in that sense, just to, well, oh yeah, absolutely. Like I say, a lot of this, excuse the public, goes over my head rather than in my brain. But it's so fascinating, and I wonder as well if that is, the case for a lot of people that, these kind of reconstructions or the lived, I saw somebody else mentioned in the comments as well, the importance of these kind of lived experiences as well, what actually will get through then if there isn't that link in the brain between, kind of this is something dangerous, let's not do it kind of thing. Yeah.
And an interesting point as well is what I've just described is even more delayed in things like ADHD, but that's probably a conversation for another day.
I mean, we'll have to have it. It's great as well. Like we literally work in the same department. I don't think I've ever actually spoke about this project to you. So thank you, Steve, and the N8.
In the car, but nothing.
I love those chats as well. There's some other really great comments in the chat that I'd be more than happy to respond to. I am conscious of time though, Steve. Do we need to move on?
I was going to suggest, a couple of really interesting things coming up there. If you want to maybe follow up in the chat or with people, that'd be great. I'm just conscious that we need to move on. But that was really interesting, and lots of really interesting topics it brought up. Thanks very much, Ryan. So moving on, our next presentation is Professor Dawn Watkins, and Dawn is Professor of Law in the School of Law at Sheffield. She joined the university in 2022, having previously been Professor at Law at Leicester. A qualified solicitor, Dawn's research explores children's understanding of law in their everyday lives and incorporates aspects of gamification of research methods. And she's going to talk today about her project Fortitude, as you can see. Over to you, Dawn.
Can you hear me all right, Steve? Yeah, great. And you can see the slides you said. Brilliant. Okay, you'll be pleased to know that I practiced this and I can nail it in about 10 minutes. So I'm going to fly through at rapid speed. So as you can see from this first slide, this project started at the University of Leicester, where I used to work. It was suspended due to COVID and because I moved university. So it's sort of, it's going to finish in May 25, which is late because of the suspension. I want to just to emphasize that I'm leading the project, but there's lots of other people involved, not all these people full time, but we've got a team working out of Sheffield and also a brilliant team of people at Nottingham Trent in psychology supporting the project as well. The project kind of only makes sense if I give you some background. So I'm going to give you that and then briefly tell you about Law in Children's Lives, which was the proof of concept for Project Fortitude, which I'll focus on mostly. So the background is that I've been teaching law for a number of years, and as part of my work I've taught a range of subjects, one of which was family law, and I was asked to teach the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child to our family law students at Leicester, sort of around 2010, 2012, around those years. And I was doing that, and around that time, at the same time, was the tragic death of Daniel Pelker in Coventry. And Daniel was 4 years old and a school-aged child, so he was in reception, and he was being abused by his mother and stepfather, and part of that abuse was that he wasn't being fed properly, and he was scavenging in bins at school. And part of the serious case review report said that whilst there was concerns about his behaviour, about him doing that, but there's no record of anyone ever speaking to Daniel about why he was doing that. And the mum's explanation that he had an eating disorder was accepted, which I honestly don't know what to do with that information. I find it terrible. At the same time, sort of just in my normal life, I was out with my youngest daughter, and we were in a shop, and she went up to buy. She said she was sort of 9 or 10 at the time, and she wanted to buy something with her own money, so she wanted to do that herself. So I said that's fine. I watched her do that, sort of stood back and let her do that, and I could see that she was having a bit more of an involved conversation with the person at the counter than you would normally have, but she wasn't looking back to me, so she just carried on. When she came back, I said, so what was going on there? And she said, well, you know, I paid and then he didn't give me the right change. And then so I said, could I have the right change? And he said he had given me the right change, but I said he hadn't. And so now I've got the right change. So I had all this kind of going on, that there's me teaching law students about the rights of children that empower them. There's my own daughter behaving in a very sort of empowered way herself, probably because her mum's a solicitor. But at the same time, you've got other children in the news who have no idea about their rights and are not listened to and are not asked their opinion. So I got chatting to a friend of mine who's called Ralph Wood. This is me in my pink cardigan phase in the middle here with Ralph and some law students. Ralph is a law graduate, but also a head teacher of a primary school, or was at the time. And so we just took our street law students into that school, and we did a mock trial of Jack and the Beanstalk. And then we asked the children, they sat with some law students in groups, and they did a draw the law activity. And from that, you could see very much that when you ask children about law, they are coming out with sort of criminal law themes, and very much it was all very depressing. And certainly they're seeing law as a constraining force in their lives, definitely not as an empowering force in their lives. So from that, I love chatting to people. I love this environment where we're sharing ideas and building networks. I got chatting to a very brilliant colleague of mine at Leicester, Professor Mandy Burton, and said, you know, it would be great to do some proper research on children's views about law and their rights. And wouldn't it be cool if you could just do it in a game? So my children had Nintendo DSs at the time that I really like playing on. I said, even if you could like just do it on a DS or something, it would be really cool, wouldn't it? And so that, to cut a really long story short, led to the Law in Children's Lives project. It was an 18-month project funded by the ESRC. So worked with a team, and we created a game called Adventures with Lex. It was a tablet game, as you can see in the picture. And it was basically a survey, actually. And it was like a series of things happened in each world. And children were invited to give their response, like either by pressing an answer or drag and drop, or a number of different ways of responding. And then they're invited to speak into the game to tell Lex the reason for the choices they've made. And as you can see, we work with over 600 children at primary age. And one of the notable findings was that we deliberately didn't use the phrase children's rights in the game because we wanted to see if it would come out in their explanations of their choices. But no child referred to children's rights at all. There were some very limited references to the word rights, but nothing around children's rights. So that the development of that game which was essentially a research gathering tool was proof of concept for Project Fortitude, which is funded by the ERC under a consolidated grant. And rather than sort of gathering data, the aim of Project Fortitude is to, again, use with games, drawing on theories of play and game-based learning. But now, instead of gathering data, it's to educate. So it's to improve legal capability, which we're breaking down into legal knowledge, skills and confidence of children and young people. And we're working with a wide age range of from sort of 3 up to 15. It's broken down in, our work's broken down into a series of work packages. We are building a legal capability framework, which involves sort of theoretical work and empirical work with children. We're working with children to create measures of legal capability, and importantly, working with them to create the learning games that we hope are going to improve aspects of legal capability. Towards the end of the project, we're going to be testing the effectiveness of the games that we create across with groups, diverse groups who haven't been involved in any of the creation of the games. And then the final thing we're going to do is create an overview of how you do this, if you wanted to do this and repeat this kind of work in another population with different children and with different legal provisions. While we're at the University of Leicester, before lockdown, we did mapping. So we did group mapping and then individual mapping, and we just invited children to draw the places they go, the things that happen, kind of things that happen to them in various places that they go. And we worked with sort of children. The youngest was about 3 and the oldest was 15. We were about to carry on with that, but we got stopped because of lockdown. But the data that we gathered was still useful in identifying these domains. And these domains are really places where we can situate law-related scenarios. So since we've been back at the University of Sheffield, or back working again, and now we've moved to the University of Sheffield, we have recruited children. Primary is definitely easier than secondary in terms of recruitment. We worked, because we were doing resource development, from an ethical point of view, we worked on an opt-out basis. So parents and carers were given the opportunity to opt out, and we ended up working with the whole of Key Stage 2 in one primary school, which does raise challenges in terms of participatory research. It was brilliant fun. And we're working with 2 secondary schools in Sheffield as well. We did stuff like, so we created legal scenarios within the socio-legal domains, or socio-physical domains, sorry. We asked the children to diamond sort these into ones that they felt were most interesting to them, because that can inform where we're going to start in our game-based learning, and also helps us with situational judgment tests we're developing. We then did some storyboarding of those scenarios. That helps us sort of gather the language and the thinking around some of the stories through the stories that the children develop. Really pleased that we've recruited 2 advisory boards. One is a group of Year 4 children, so they'll stay with us right through the project. And we go and see them every half term and let them know what we're doing. We ask their views on planned research activities. And we've just recruited a secondary age advisory board. And these young people are, as part of their learning, doing game development, digital game development. So they are brilliantly helpful, and it's lovely to be working with them because they genuinely are much more expert than I am on digital game development. We're doing all of this empirical work, further informs the framework, but we're also sort of developing the theory on that as well. As part of our measure, the Nottingham team are creating a rights and confidence questionnaire, which is a psychometric scale, which Michelle, in her obvious quantitative abilities, would know all about. So we're doing that along the lines set out by Develis, which I'm quite good at describing now, but couldn't do myself. One of the challenges has been that the response rate to that has been much slower than we wanted, but I've checked it this morning and it's looking quite good now. So I could probably turn that sad face into more of a smile on that one. One thing we really are keen to do is to work with children with special educational needs and or disabilities. So we have got a contact in a school that wants to work with us, which is in the south actually, but it's proving really difficult to sort of correspond with them. So if someone has said to me, I don't know Sheffield because I'm new, if anyone has got a contact in a school, someone mentioned me Seven Hills, I was going to contact them. But having personal contacts makes a massive difference, obviously. Yeah, so that, as I said, that is actually really flying tour through what we're doing, but I thought I'll leave plenty of time for the next speaker. But thank you very much for listening. That's my contact details. I feel like really edgy because I can give you a QR code to our website, but yeah, that's about it. I don't know if anyone's got any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dawn. Really fascinating again. Any questions for Dawn? One thing I was going to ask, which you might not know the answer to because it doesn't directly relate to your project, just thinking about my children's own primary school is a UNICEF rights respecting school, and how initiatives like that help develop legal capability.
Yeah, so the school we're working with is a rights respecting school, or the school we worked with last term is a rights respecting school. The school we're going to be we've got a different primary we're working with this term, and that's not rights respecting, so it's going to be interesting working with different groups. Yeah, but you would hope it would have, that's one thing we'll be testing, you would hope it would have a big impact. Yeah.
Any other questions for Dawn before we move on?
I can see Ryan's comments. No, I was listening to Ryan thinking, Ryan and I need to have a cup of coffee. So yeah.
I'm glad to make collecting connections across Sheffield today.
Yeah, it's a great way to get to know people when you're new.
It's amazing as well, isn't it? Because it's, you know, this N8, the beauty of this kind of N8 webinar or whatever, we literally like work like what, a couple of 100 yards away or something like that.
Yeah, it's a shame, but yeah.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. Coffee's on me, by the way.
Oh, yeah, deal. Okay. Thank you.
Good, thanks very much again, Dawn.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And because of that, we're also now back on track, which is brilliant. So our final presentation is from Dr. Lauren Powell, and Lauren is a lecturer in psychology and education in the School of Education. And her research interests focus on the psychoeducation of young people with neurodisabilities. She's also interested in the use of innovative co-design methodologies in the design of complex interventions of children and young people with neurodisabilities. And I will now hand over to Lauren for her presentation.
Hello, can everyone see and hear everything they need to see and hear?
Perfect.
Yes, thanks.
Right. I'm just looking at the time to make sure I don't go over. Okay. So apologies in advance if my puppy decides to pop up on the screen. He's been asleep for the whole presentation, but of course, as soon as I start talking, he's going to misbehave. But I'm sure we'll be fine. So thank you for having me, everybody. Today, I'm going to talk about some psychoeducation for children with ADHD and how we co-designed a resource for this population. So I'll cover some key terms just to make sure we're all on the same page. Talk a bit about co-design, what we did, what it, you know, how we've implemented it and why we think it might have worked. And there might be some time for questions as well. So hopefully I won't be teaching too many of you to suck eggs, but when I refer to co-design, we're looking at the creativity of something that doesn't exist, whether it's a thing or a service, and that being made with people who are designers and also people who are not trained designers, and those people work together. ADHD, we're looking at developmentally inappropriate levels of hyperactivity, impulsivity, and attentiveness. There's a lot more on that. I could probably speak to you for hours on that alone, but I'll do my best not to. If anyone's got any questions about ADHD, I can talk to you about that separately, no problem. And then psychoeducation is to educate somebody about their condition and how to manage it a little bit more effectively, which can also include learning a new relevant skill. So co-design, the reason I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just saying what it is and what it isn't is because there's an awful lot of, shall we say, to be polite, variable practice out there. Participatory methods is like the umbrella, and then underneath that, one of those methods is co-design. So I've mentioned the co is with, I've mentioned designers working with people who aren't designers. I've mentioned that non-designers can include anyone who basically isn't a trained designer. Usually they are a stakeholder or an end user. So if we're making, say, a resource for children with ADHD, our end user would be the children with ADHD, and the stakeholders might be their families, carers, school teachers, clinicians, etc. It's an iterative process, so it's not necessarily ducks in a row. That's why I've got ducks on the slide. And it usually involves a prototype. So instead of saying, can you imagine this, or what might you like this to look like, we have a thing and they can see it and feel it and touch it or experience it, because visualization can be difficult if you've not seen what it is we're talking about before. So what co-design is not, and what would be deemed poor practice by many, is asking users and stakeholders questions, going away and acting on it, and then putting a full stop on it, and that's it. That's not co-design. There's nothing wrong with asking users and stakeholders questions, going away and acting on it, but it is wrong to call that co-design, as is running a few focus groups or just a few interviews. That's not iterative and that's not co-design. Nothing wrong with it, but again, you know, if it is what it is, say what it is rather than give it a fancy name that's not true. Lots of projects I've known to involve lots of stakeholders for convenience, and then just a couple of end users to tick a box because it's harder often to get the end users. And sometimes they report as end users and stakeholders being equally involved. And then when you delve a little bit deeper, you find out that's not the case. So personally, I quite like to differentiate between the two to be completely transparent. Not involving a trained designer or any kind of designer in that matter. There can be one-off activities that are reported as co-design. But if that's not iterative, it's not really co-design because you're not going back to people and asking more questions. It can result, if we don't do things properly, in research waste. We can produce something that's no good to anybody. It wastes a lot of time and resources. Something that, sorry, my dog just sorry. No, I'm so sorry. Monty, normally the good one. Stop it. Experience-based co-design, I'm going to move. Honestly, I've done these presentations before. I've had no issue. I'm so sorry. I'm going to move. And hopefully they'll be quiet. So as I was saying, experience-based co-design is beyond the scope of this presentation, but more information can be found about it there. And it is different to co-design, something that doesn't include designers. It's often done in the NHS as like a quicker thing to do. But again, if we rush things, quite often, like I say, we can end up with research waste. And that's not to badmouth experience-based co-design, but evidence does suggest that that is more likely to end in research waste. So I'm just kind of being more explicit in terms of the methods here. So briefly, the research gap is we've got evidence that suggests psychoeducation can be of benefit for children with ADHD. It can improve their knowledge on their condition, their attitudes. It can improve misconceptions, and it can also improve treatment adherence, which is particularly poor in children with ADHD. And also evidence does suggest it can help with their social skills. In addition, we've got clinical guidelines that recommend developmentally appropriate or age-appropriate information for the child that has ADHD. But before this project, we weren't aware of anything that kind of ticked all those boxes, which seemed quite strange to us. So what we've done is developed a resource for children with ADHD to teach them about their condition, how to manage it more effectively. And this is now available, and I can show you how that is available shortly. I'm going to focus on one example of the co-design process, but just know that this was an iterative process and lots of other things happened before this. For example, Lego Serious Play workshops. If you don't know what that is, there's a link there. And if you want to know what we did, there's a link there for that as well. We had lots of conversations with stakeholders. Yes, end users, but we did start with the stakeholders because of the vulnerable nature of this group. We were very careful as to when to include them in the process, because what we didn't want to do is ask them questions that were either too abstract or give them a resource and say, what do you think? And that resource hasn't been looked at by qualified eyes, shall we say. Like I say, everything was iterative, and we were communicating with research and graphic designers throughout. So this did clearly involve people that are trained to be a designer, and also, you know, end users and stakeholders. So we did some initial base co-design activities. So one example is we did some workshops to find out what children found difficult about their ADHD, where they found these things difficult, what they wanted to learn about their ADHD, and what kind of paper-based tasks they liked and that they might like to help them learn about their ADHD. So we had 4 activities for the workshop. You can see some pictures of the workshops on the right-hand side, consent obtained. There were some templates when they first arrived, like an outline of a superhero with a cape, and they just wrote down good things about themselves and drew, like kind of populated this only in terms of the good things about themselves. They had a parent with them as well, so we had dyads, they weren't on their own. Then everyone sat around a table and watched a video around ADHD and what makes life more challenging for them, and that kind of it spurred on conversation. And we thought that was a bit of a risk, and we had to be flexible with the nature of the population, but it actually worked really well. And it went on nicely to talk about where they find these things difficult, so school, home, with friends, whatever. We also had lots of slips of paper for the 3rd activity, which had challenges that they might come across as having ADHD, and the ones they thought, nah, I'm not bothered about that, screwed them up and put them in a bin that we had in the middle of the table, and the ones they liked, they stuck on a bit of paper. And then if they were comfortable making the decision, they put stars next to their favorite ones, just so we knew what they really wanted to know about. And then we had a break. And then in their eyes, the break continued, but in our eyes, part 2 of the workshop started. And all I said was, oh, hi guys, there's some paper-based resources on a table there at the side, which you can see here. If you want, or some activities, I think I might have said, if you want to give them a go, you can, but you don't have to. Because we thought actions often speak louder than words. So if they all decided that they were rubbish and they weren't going to do them, fine. But actually, everybody did all of the activities, which spoke volumes. I'll give you an idea of what those activities are shortly. So a very brief overview of those findings was that they found difficulties at school, such as concentrating, the pace of the lessons, making friends, noise, at home, waking up in the morning, managing their emotions, apparently telling the truth. It's also quite hard. They'd like to learn about medication, what ADHD is, how to keep calm, manage their anger. One child even said, why doesn't Calpol work? So they really wanted to understand that, and they liked the paper-based tasks. They enjoyed them. Speaking of which, an example, we've got some positive words around ADHD in a word search, true or false quiz, a maze. So ADHD is not caused by being naughty. It's not because you eat too much sugar. It's because your brain works a little bit differently. We had some fortune tellers, and we had like a sleep hygiene section. That's often quite difficult in ADHD sleep. So, things like they'd have to circle the curtains, close the curtains, turn the TV off, put the tablet away, turn the light off, etc. Now, this translated into a prototype, and examples of what that prototype looks like are here. So we included the maze. We had a reward at the end, which was a certificate for completing the book, because we know that lack of dopamine, a chemical in the brain, means that people with ADHD crave that dopamine, and one way to get a dopamine hit is through reward. And then what they learned, so true or false quiz. Once we had this prototype, this co-designed product, we then wanted to evaluate this co-designed product. So this is no longer co-design, this is evaluation of something that is co-designed. We of course weren't going to let COVID get in the way, so we moved everything online. We had some sketch notes for respondent validity to check that we interpreted what children and young people, that's CAYP, what they said properly. And we talked through the sketches to check accuracy. So what I mean by that is you and I might make notes with words. We found someone that makes notes by drawing pictures, and I'll show you an example of that. We developed the final iteration from this evaluation. And if you want to see the publication that's related to it, you can just click on the link there, and I'll send the slides to Stephen shortly so they can be circulated. So for the workshops and the literature, luckily for us, married up quite nicely. And examples of this include, and are certainly not limited to, children with ADHD often underestimate the difficulties that they have that relate to their ADHD. It was important that we were positive in the resource. There's this running sort of joke that's not that funny, that children with ADHD think their name is Stop It because that's all they hear. And that's quite sad, really, especially as we know that children with ADHD are more likely to have a lower self-esteem, poorer quality of life, etc. So yeah, people, including stakeholders, appreciated the positive light or the positive stance the resource took. They like the activities, and they quite like that it could be personalized as well. So the top 2/3 of each page was kind of like, this is what ADHD is. But on the bottom third, they could cut it off. So it was a separate booklet if they wanted, but they didn't have to. And that's like my ADHD. That's what makes me, me. This bit is about me. That bit's about everyone generally. And they quite liked that. This is an example of sketch notes. If I draw your attention to the bottom left here of this rather stressed looking lad that says time out, we put time out as a tactic to calm down in the resource. And he pulled that face and said, that's what happens when I'm told off. I have to take time out. Could we say break time instead? So things like that were fed back to us, which were really helpful. There was a couple of instances where we had siblings on the call. Poor Chris, bless him, he's not, you know, he could be left and right-handed better than I could be, but not at the same time. So blue was for one of the children and green was for the other, and that was their favorite colors. So he could still depict both children in the same sort of image, if you like. I'm not going to go through this with you now because of time, but we did feed back to the participants, the children and the parents, and we also shared this with stakeholders as well, so they knew what they'd done had helped, how and why, and things like that. This resource is now used in charities, in NHS trust, schools, the council, across the UK. It's available on a number of websites, including the ADHD Foundation. And next, we'd like to develop something similar for an autistic child population. We have got a prototype, and we will be evaluating this in the spring this year. If you'd like a link to it, the top one's probably the easiest. That's how you can just have a look at the resource. It can be used. I do ask if anyone wants to distribute it, if you just email me to let me know, just so I can track it in terms of impact, but it's absolutely free to use. That link should pretty much take you directly to it, just so that you're confident if you click on it, you've got the right thing, you've got your owl and your dog. So the reason we think it's successful, I am aware of time, and this is going to be done within about a minute or two, just to be aware. The reason we think this is successful is because stakeholders were invested in the development of this, and the stakeholders that were invested in the development are also the people who are distributing this and are telling their colleagues about it, who are also distributing this, and so on. The children themselves are involved because it could be distributed widely, but if the children hate it, you've hit like a dead end, really, haven't you? So to have the input from these children has been invaluable, and they're brutally honest as well, which is great. Yeah, so it made sure that we met the needs of everybody. It made sure that we were singing from the same song sheet as the NHS, because if we weren't, then again, that would be another dead end. We considered context in terms of where they might use the activity book, context in terms of their needs themselves as well. We had designers on board. It was iterative. We had lots of really positive feedback from the resource as well. So I'm not going to go any further. I just want you to know that if you would like to be involved or have any questions beyond the seminar, then please email me on this email address. If you miss it, the slides will be distributed via Stephen. I'm not going through these slides now, but I've included them for people who might think, oh, but she's doing autism as well, and she's not mentioned that. So there's some feedback. This is what we've found so far from the systematic review, and also from the co-design process of the autism resource. We've finished the co-design process now, and we are on to the evaluation this spring, as I've said. Here's some references, and thank you for listening. Do you have any questions?
Thanks so much, Lauren, and thanks to Monty as well. I can see now why you got so excited. There's not many research presentations with such cute pictures of dogs in it.
Oh, so. Sorry. Ernie's normally the pain, but Monty decided to pipe up then. I'm so sorry, but I thought if I maybe
not at all. Not at all. Really interesting presentation and a really great example of co-design. I think everybody will agree. Any questions for Lauren about her presentation at all? And one thing I was going to ask you mentioned about impact, and it's such a brilliant sort of resource you've got. Do you have any feel for how many children you've managed to reach so far with it?
I haven't really got a number, but I've got a number per trust, but we're in of trust that the way in which people use it is in the trust, it either is sent as a link to existing patients and or given to newly diagnosed patients. They also just put it on their website, so anyone could look at it as well. Schools rarely use it in a whole class situation because of time constraints, but it does happen. Senkos often use it with children, and or send it home with children and their families. One thing I didn't mention actually is that we found that it's more of a communication aid between a parent and a child, because describing a neurodisability to a child in a way that they understand requires you as a parent to understand it. And even if you do understand it, that's still a hard thing to do. So that's something that's really helped quite a lot of families. Some children have actually gone on the medication just by reading it and saying, oh, I get it now. Okay, I'll take it. You know, which has helped them. And that's not to say ADHD medication is right for everybody, but it was for those particular children whose GP and parents were really trying, or their nurse was really trying to get them to take it. And they were like, nope. But it turned out they just didn't get it. And now they do. So it has been really helpful, and it has been distributed quite widely. And I'm always getting emails from people saying, oh, just so you know, we're using it here in Scotland or Manchester or, you know, these places. And I'm sure there's other places that are using it that I don't know about.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's really underappreciated, helping children to understand and help with their own condition. As a parent, you're tempted to sort of take it all on yourself and sort of deal with their challenges, but to really help them and work with them through it, I think it's really fantastic.
Absolutely. And as they grow up, they're expected to kind of become more and more independent, and that includes understanding and self-management of whatever it is they have. And if they haven't had that training, if you like, when they're younger, you know, like we get help to get dressed, and then over time you do your own shoelaces or you do your own, you know, but with that, if it goes from nothing to something, it's like falling off a cliff, isn't it? So
interesting question from Nick in the chat that says, to what extent does this compound ADHD as a medicalized diagnosis, taking the emphasis off society to adapt to people?
If you look at some of the activities, there are things in there like what others can do to help me, how to help me explain it to my friends, how to explain how it affects them to their friends. So I think there's a bit of a balance, to be honest. There's things they can do to help themselves. Like we know diet doesn't cause ADHD, but then if you have loads of sugar, that's going to exacerbate things, especially if you've got the hyperactivity presentation of ADHD. So there's things you can do to help yourself that society doesn't, you know, society shouldn't necessarily adapt and say, yeah, eat chocolate all day, knock yourself out, because we know that's not healthy. How can I help my friends learn about me? And it's, you know, things like talking to an adult at school to make life easier. So yeah, I mean, I'm quite happy to disclose I've got ADHD myself, and there are certain things that I've learned about myself over the years that I think, yeah, I don't care about society. If they're not going to adapt, then tough. But children don't think like that. So we're not putting the onus on the child in terms of, this is your problem, you learn to deal with it. Not at all. It's a positive thing. Your brain works differently, and that's great in many ways. And there's things you can do to help with the challenges, and there's things that other people can do to help with the challenges. So I don't know if that answers your question, Nick. Oh, good. Yeah, it's yeah, I have huge opinions on this. I just have to rein myself in so I don't talk too much.
Thanks, Lauren. That's really fantastic. And thanks also to all our other presenters, Michelle, Ryan and Dawn, for some really great and some great food for thought today. And we've hit 2:30 exactly, so that's brilliant. Just one final thank you as well to Hannah and to Jill, who are our fantastic Child of the North institutional champions at Sheffield, who helped organise today's webinars. That's brilliant. And thank you to everybody else for coming along. As I say, the recording of this will be circulated along with all the copies of the presentation. So if you want to follow up on any of the individual projects or any of these discussions, then you can do with the individual presenters. So yeah, just a final thank you for everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.